Today's video is going to be on what sequencing is and what sequencing is not. I do a lot of videos on sequencing because it really is the essence of learning a golf swing, is learning how to move energy through your body, and the order matters because the order allows angular momentum to continue to transfer and add to the natural acceleration of a golf club. Most golfers are always out of sequence. Any golfer that struggles has sequencing issues. So getting good at sequencing is important. So what we can do is we can break down sequencing into physical movements like so, okay? So when we talk about sequencing, when we get to the top of the swing and we change directions, the first thing that goes is the pelvis, and then the pelvis moves the rib cage thorax, and then the arms start to pick up the energy from the thorax, and then finally the golf club. And if we do this all really well, we end up with a really nice solid impact position with the shaft slightly forward, hitting slightly down for an iron, or just nice and lined up with the driver. Now, what I just described there is a bunch of movements. Now, here's one of the big issues in sequencing. I can talk about that, but that just happened in 0.3 of a second or less. So sequencing, I want you to think of as more of what happens. Where we get in a little bit of a mistake, and I think it's fine for understanding the principle of what's happening, but it's not what it really feels like, okay? So if I break down sequencing into movement patterns, let's say, okay, I'm gonna go hip, then thorax, then arm, then golf club, I can definitely kind of practice isolating those movements, but when it comes down to the practical application, when we see sequencing, good sequencing in a tour pro or a really good golfer, we're seeing something happening. It's not something that they're doing to make it happen. So here's the issue with sequencing is, albeit true, everything I told you in the order is correct, one thing starts it, but sequencing is the unfolding and the transmission of angular momentum through your body, okay? So what does that mean? Well, in 0.3 of a second, I'm gonna start with this motion here, and it kicks the energy through my thorax to the arms to the club, the club, I should say, and it continually extends outward and downward to the direction that I want the actual swing to go, okay? So you don't actually control the sequencing, you get it started in the right direction and then it happens. And that's one of the things that's so difficult to kind of understand, and why it's so difficult to try to copy a good player's golf swing, is because what you see them doing and what's actually happening are very, very different. So I'm gonna bring in my training aid, the Pro here, to kind of get an understanding, okay? Now I'm gonna have great sequencing on this swing. But what's different is that I'm not trying to move all these body parts I talked about. It's the natural extending of angular momentum as it works from my chest center outwards actually is causing that to happen. So once the energy transfers from my lower into my upper, as my upper accelerates, my arms naturally lag for a second, but then they start to extend, which slows my chest down and speeds my arms up. And then as my arms get down to right about here, the momentum now exchanges, or the club has been lagging behind the wrist, it now starts to, the momentum extends into the Pro here, or the club, and then it keeps going and it keeps extending. And that naturally slows my arms down. So I don't really consciously make individual movements through there. As momentum transfers, this thing that we see of these accelerations and decelerations of the pieces of the body is actually just a phenomenon of physics. And getting the feel of that is really, really unique, because you don't actually you don't try to make those movements happen, you actually feel them in one motion. And that's where my training aid the Pro comes in, because it shows you the dynamics of sequencing and what sequencing is not, by bending or forming an angle at any point in time. So if I, for instance, very basic, if I break sequencing by just casting the club, well, it really bends early. But anytime I make movements in the wrong direction at the wrong time, we're gonna see the momentum doesn't flow, okay? But when I swing it correctly and everything stays in a line, I actually start to experience sequencing. And I promise you, this doesn't feel, it looks like a great swing movement, but it doesn't feel like what you probably would mentally be trying to do if you're trying to move individual body parts. And I think the golf instruction industry has to be really careful, because there definitely is an order of motion, but I don't want to get in people's minds that I physically do things with the individual kind of muscle groups. In fact, to have really good sequencing, I learn how to train my muscles to stay in kind of a passive or more extended state, so the momentum can transfer through and these natural accelerations and decelerations happen. So again, one of the best ways to really understand true sequencing is to master my training aid, the Pro, and really learn how to get it in a straight line as it comes through, and learn how to get it to line up right where about you'd want it to strike a golf ball. And that really shows you the feeling that sequencing, when we see it on video, it just feels like energy flowing. It doesn't feel like individual body parts moving. All right, I hope you guys all found that helpful, and we'll see you next time.